Before the philosopher king came the conqueror. Before the edicts carved in stone came the silence of ambition. And before the man who would renounce war stood a boy born into an empire built by it, watching, learning, and waiting for a throne he was never meant to inherit. In the year 304 BC, when winter mist still clung to the waters where the Ganges and Sun rivers met, the city of Pataliputra rose above the plains of Magadha, like a promise made in stone. Its walls, broad enough for 4 chariots to pass abreast, enclosed a world transformed by conquest and cunning. Timber palaces stretched toward the sky, their pillars carved from single trunks of teak, their roofs gleaming with tiles that caught the morning light. Through its streets moved merchants from lands so distant, their names sounded like incantations, Greeks bearing wine in amphorae, Persians wrapped in silks that whispered with each step, traders from the southern kingdoms carrying sandalwood and pearls the color of moonlight. This was the capital of the Mauryan Empire, and it pulsed with the confidence of a power still discovering the limits of its own reach. Only 2 decades had passed since Chandragupta Maurya seized the throne of Magadha, expelled the Greek satraps from the northwestern frontier, and bound the quarreling kingdoms of the subcontinent under a single command. What he had forged through iron and strategy, his son Bindusara now maintained through diplomacy and the slow, patient work of administration. The empire stretched from the shadow of the Hindu Kush to the mangrove forests of Bengal, from the Himalayas to the edge of the Deccan Plateau. Vast, restless, and hungry for order, it was into this world of borders still being drawn that a child was born, one among nearly 100 royal sons and daughters who filled the women's quarters of the palace. His mother, Subhadrangi, was called by another name as well, Dhamma, meaning righteousness, though whether she earned that epithet through piety or accident of birth, the chronicles do not say. What they do record is this: she was not of the highest rank among Bindusara's queens. Her lineage carried no weight of ancient dynasties, no alliances with powerful clans. In a court where every marriage was a treaty and every child a potential heir, this made her son's claim to succession fragile before he had drawn his first breath. They named him Ashoka, without sorrow, though later generations would wonder if the name was prophecy or irony. He entered a household crowded with ambition, where brothers eyed one another across banquet halls and mothers schemed in perfumed chambers. The palace was a world unto itself, governed by protocols as rigid as any law, where even the order in which princes walked to the assembly reflected the hierarchy of their mother's status. In such a place, a boy learned early that power was not a birthright, but a prize to be seized or surrendered. His childhood unfolded in the measured rhythms of royal education. Before dawn, when the city still slept beneath its blanket of river fog, tutors arrived to instill the disciplines required of those who might one day command. He learned Sanskrit from Brahmin scholars who traced the verses of the Vedas with voices that turned scripture into music. He studied the Arthashastra, that great manual of statecraft composed by his grandfather's minister Chanakya, a text that taught governance as a science of force and calculation, where kings ruled through a trinity of power: the scepter, the treasury, and the spy. The lessons were unsparing in their pragmatism. He learned that a kingdom survives not through the love of its subjects, but through the efficiency of its administration, that taxes must be collected with precision, rebellions crushed without hesitation, and potential rivals eliminated before they become threats, that every man has his price, and every alliance its expiration. The Arthashastra spoke of governance as gardening. One cultivates loyalty, prunes dissent, and poisons the roots of conspiracy before they spread. Young Ashoka absorbed these teachings the way soil absorbs rain, letting them seep deep into the clay of his character. Yet the education of a Mauryan prince extended beyond statecraft. In the courtyards of the palace, where dust rose in golden clouds beneath the afternoon sun, he trained in the arts of war, swords of tempered steel, bows that required the strength of two men to draw, the handling of war elephants whose trumpeting could break an enemy's nerve. All these became familiar to his hands. The martial disciplines were not merely physical, but mental. He learned to read the terrain as a language, to anticipate the enemy's thought before it became action, to endure pain without flinching and exhaustion without complaint. The young prince proved himself capable, then more than capable. His tutors noted his seriousness, the way his gaze fixed on a problem until it yielded its secrets. He did not possess the easy charm of some of his brothers, those princes whose laughter echoed through the corridors and whose presence lit rooms like lamps. Chroniclers would later describe him as physically unremarkable, even unattractive, features that might have kindled his father's initial disregard. In a court dazzled by appearance and lineage, Ashoka's strength lay hidden beneath an unpromising surface, like iron ore waiting for the furnace. What he lacked in beauty or maternal influence, he compensated through competence that could not be ignored. When debates arose in the assembly over matters of trade routes or provincial taxation, it was sometimes his voice that cut through the noise, with a solution both practical and decisive. When hunting parties ranged into the forests beyond the capital seeking tiger and boar, he returned with his quarry more often than not. Slowly, quietly, he began to distinguish himself from the crowd of royal sons who lounged in the palace gardens, content to let their futures be decided by others. The empire itself provided the backdrop against which his character formed. His grandfather, Chandragupta's conquests were still fresh in memory, told and retold by veterans who bore their scars like titles of honor. The old king had begun as an adventurer, with nothing but audacity and the counsel of a brilliant minister. He had seized the throne of Magadha, while Alexander's successors still squabbled over the Greeks' empire, turning chaos into opportunity. In 305 BC, when Seleucus Nicator marched east hoping to reclaim the Indian territories Alexander had touched, Chandragupta met him with an army of disciplined infantry, swift cavalry, and war elephants that moved like living fortresses. The battle's outcome sent the Greek general home with a treaty. In exchange for 500 elephants, Seleucus ceded all lands east of the Hindu Kush. The princess he sent as part of that treaty became one more thread in the tapestry of the Mauryan court. By the time Chandragupta abdicated around 298 BC, renouncing his throne to become a Jain monk, he had built not merely a kingdom, but a system, a vast machinery of governance that could function even in the absence of a single commanding will. Roads connected distant provinces, some paved with brick, others merely cleared and guarded. Along these arteries moved not only merchants and pilgrims, but also the eyes and ears of the state, spies who reported on the loyalty of governors, the contentment of villagers, the movements of potential threats. The old emperor had learned from his minister that power rests on information, and information requires infrastructure. Bindusara inherited this system and expanded it with methodical patience. Where his father had conquered through boldness, the son governed through persistence. He pushed the empire's borders southward into the forests and plateaus of the Deccan, bringing kingdoms that had never bent to northern rule into the Mauryan fold. The campaigns were neither as dramatic nor as swift as Chandragupta's wars, but they were effective. Territory accumulated like compound interest, slowly at first, then with gathering momentum. In the palace, the young Ashoka watched and absorbed. He saw how envoys from distant lands arrived bearing gifts and grievances, how his father balanced the demands of Brahmin priests against the council of Buddhist monks and Jain ascetics, how every decision rippled outward through the provinces, like a stone dropped in still water. He learned that empire was not merely conquest, but constant negotiation, with local chieftains who required flattery, with merchant guilds who required protection, with the populace who required just enough prosperity to forestall rebellion. The religious landscape of the empire was as diverse as its peoples. In the markets of Pataliputra, one could hear prayers offered to a dozen different visions of the divine Brahmin priests chanted verses beside Buddhist monks who spoke of the middle way. Jain ascetics, naked and dust-covered, preached the doctrine of ahimsa, non-violence toward all living beings, while Ajivika philosophers debated the nature of fate and free will. Chandragupta himself had ended his days following Jain practices, fasting unto death in the distant south. The court reflected this plurality. No single orthodoxy commanded absolute allegiance, though the Brahmanical tradition held pride of place in matters of ritual and legitimacy. Ashoka moved through these worlds, observing but not yet choosing. He made offerings at the prescribed times, spoke respectfully to holy men of every stripe, and gave no indication that any particular teaching had seized his heart. To the casual observer, he appeared like most young nobles, dutiful in observance, pragmatic in belief, keeping the gods at arm's length until the hour came when their favor might be needed. It was the posture of a man being trained to rule an empire of many faiths, where every gesture of devotion was also a gesture of politics. Yet beneath the surface of court life, tensions simmered. Chief among Ashoka's rivals was his older half-brother Susima, son of a higher-ranking queen, favored by their father from birth. Susima possessed the advantages Ashoka lacked: a mother whose family commanded wealth and influence, physical presence that drew eyes and inspired confidence, and the presumption of succession that shaped every courtier's calculation. Around him gathered those who hoped to rise in his reflected light, administrators who praised his judgment, generals who sought his patronage, merchants who offered loans against the promise of future favor. Other brothers filled the palace as well: Vitashoka, Vigatashoka, and more, whose names have been worn away by time's patient erosion. They formed factions and alliances, married into influential families, accepted governorships in distant provinces where they could build their own power bases. The court was a chessboard where every piece moved with calculation, where friendship was a tactic and family a contingency. In such an environment, trust was the rarest commodity of all. Ashoka learned to navigate these currents with caution. He cultivated no obvious faction, made no ostentatious displays of ambition. When the moment came to speak in council, he offered competence without flourish. When opportunities arose for glory, he accepted them without grasping. It was the strategy of a man who understood that in a crowded field of contenders, survival often depends on being underestimated until the hour arrives when being underestimated no longer matters. The seasons turned, and the boy became a young man. His 14th year passed, then his 15th, and with each monsoon that swept across the plains of Magadha, the question of succession grew more urgent in the whispered conversations of the court. Bindusara showed no signs of failing health, but empires do not wait for nature's timing. Governors needed to know whom to cultivate, generals whom to obey. The machinery of power, built to function under a single hand, grew anxious in the lengthening shadow of uncertainty. It was in this atmosphere, charged with unspoken ambition and rehearsed deference, that Ashoka's character hardened into its final shape. He learned to read men's faces for the truths their words concealed. He learned that generosity could be as effective as cruelty, and that restraint often impressed more than display. Most of all, he learned patience, the deep, cold patience of someone who understands that fate sometimes favors not the swift but the stubborn. Beyond the palace walls, the empire continued its expansion. Each year brought new territories into the fold, new peoples into the census, new revenues into the treasury. The Mauryan state was becoming something unprecedented in the subcontinent's long history. Not merely a kingdom of kingdoms, but a genuine imperial system with standardized weights and measures, uniform coinage, and laws that applied from the mountains to the sea. It was an achievement born of Chanakya's vision and Chandragupta's sword, maintained now by Bindusara's patient governance. Yet even in this age of order and prosperity, one kingdom remained beyond Mauryan reach. To the east, along the coast, where great rivers met the Bay of Bengal, lay Kalinga, wealthy, independent, and determined to remain so. Its ports gathered the trade winds that connected India to the kingdoms of Southeast Asia. Its cities flourished on the commerce that flowed between the subcontinent and the wider world. Successive Mauryan emperors had eyed Kalinga with the acquisitive gaze of empire builders. Yet the kingdom had resisted annexation through a combination of military preparedness and diplomatic skill. This unfinished conquest would wait for another generation. For now, in the year 290 BC, as Ashoka approached his 14th birthday, the future remained unwritten. He knew only what every prince in a court of many princes knew, that destiny was not a gift, but a prize, that the throne his grandfather had seized and his father maintained would not pass automatically to any man, and that the greatest victories were often won not on battlefields, but in the quiet accumulation of respect, loyalty, and competence. The boy who had entered the world as one among many had begun, without yet knowing it, the long journey that would carry him from the shadows of succession through the crucible of civil war, from the blood-soaked fields of conquest to the profound transformation that would reshape not only his own soul, but the spiritual destiny of half a continent. The sun set over Pataliputra, turning the rivers to copper and the palace walls to gold. In the gathering dusk, braziers were lit in the courtyards, their smoke rising in thin columns toward a sky where the first stars had begun to appear. The city settled into evening, merchants closing their stalls, priests completing their rituals, the endless business of empire pausing for breath before resuming with the dawn. In one corner of the palace, a young prince sat studying maps by lamplight, tracing with his finger the roads that connected his grandfather's conquests. He did not yet know that those roads would one day carry his edicts to the edges of the known world. He did not yet dream of the transformation that awaited him in the aftermath of victory. He knew only this, that he was being prepared for something, that preparation demanded mastery, and that the empire into which he had been born, vast, powerful, and still growing, would require leaders who understood not merely how to conquer, but how to endure. The lamp flickered, the maps cast shadows on the wall, and in the darkness beyond the palace, the world waited for the man that boy would become. The first test of a prince's worth comes not in the palace where flatterers gather, but in the provinces where reality refuses to wear a courtier's mask. When the messenger arrived from Taxila, bearing news of unrest, the council chamber fell silent. Rebellion in the northwest was more than a provincial matter. It was a crack in the empire's foundation, a challenge to the very principle that distant lands could be governed from Pataliputra. The question was not whether to respond, but whom to send. Bindusara's gaze moved across the assembled princes, like a merchant appraising goods. Susima, the favored heir, stood ready with the confidence of one who had never doubted his own destiny. Other sons positioned themselves with studied casualness, each hoping to be chosen, each fearing to appear too eager. When the emperor's eyes settled on Ashoka, surprise rippled through the chamber, like wind across water. The young prince, now 18 years old, had distinguished himself through competence rather than spectacle. To send him to Taxila was not a reward, but a calculation, a test that would either validate his capabilities or remove a potential rival from consideration. Taxila lay nearly 1,000 miles to the northwest, beyond the Indus River, where the empire met the memory of Alexander's passage. Once a jewel of Greek influence, it had become the Mauryan frontier's administrative heart, controlling the trade routes that connected India to Persia and the Hellenistic kingdoms beyond. Its markets glittered with goods from distant lands, lapis from the mountains of Afghanistan, horses from the Central Asian steppes, wine and olive oil from Mediterranean ports. Through its customs, houses flowed revenues that fed the imperial treasury. To lose Taxila was to lose not merely a city, but a gateway. The unrest had begun, as such things often do, with taxation. A governor appointed from Pataliputra, a man whose loyalty to the emperor exceeded his understanding of the governed, had imposed levies that pressed beyond the traditional limits. Merchants found their profits consumed by unexpected duties. Artisan guilds discovered that their negotiated exemptions no longer held value. The city's elders sent petitions that went unanswered, their grievances lost in the distance between frontier and capital. When patience exhausted itself, protest filled the streets. Ashoka departed Pataliputra with a small retinue, soldiers enough for protection, but not so many as to suggest an army of occupation. The journey itself became an education. The Grand Trunk Road, that great artery his grandfather had improved and his father maintained, carried him through the heartland of empire. He passed through Kaushambi and Mathura, cities that had bent to Mauryan rule and prospered under it. He saw the rest houses that provided shelter to travellers, the wells dug at regular intervals, the marker stones that counted distance with administrative precision. This was the infrastructure of power, unglamorous but essential, the skeleton upon which empire's flesh was laid. Beyond the Indus, the landscape changed. The lush plains of Magadha gave way to drier country, where mountains clawed at the horizon. Here the empire felt less like an established fact and more like a promise requiring constant renewal. Garrison towns watched the passes. Border forts kept vigil against raiders from the northwest. The soldiers who manned these outposts had faces weathered by wind and sun, eyes that had seen the empire's limits and knew how fragile they could be. When Ashoka entered Taxila, he found a city balanced on the edge of violence. The markets remained open but wary, merchants conducting business with one eye on the streets. The governor cowered in his residence, protected by guards whose loyalty was measured in daily wages. The prince could have restored order through the traditional means. Arrests, executions, the public demonstration of power that turns flesh into lesson. The Arthashastra provided clear prescriptions for dealing with urban unrest. Identify the ringleaders, eliminate them swiftly, and remind the populace that the cost of rebellion always exceeds its benefits. Instead, Ashoka chose investigation. He met with the merchant guilds and artisan associations, listening to grievances that had been amplified by neglect. He reviewed the tax registers and discovered what any honest audit would have revealed: that the governor had been extracting revenues beyond imperial mandate, enriching himself while blaming Pataliputra for the burden. The solution announced itself through simple arithmetic. Ashoka removed the corrupt administrator, adjusted the tax rates to their traditional levels, and appointed local officials to positions of oversight. Order returned not through terror, but through the restoration of predictability. The chronicles would later emphasize this moment as evidence of his administrative wisdom. Yet what truly happened in Taxila was something quieter and perhaps more significant. The young prince discovered that governance need not be merely the application of force, that there existed a space between absolute control and chaos, where understanding could substitute for violence, that an empire built only on fear was an empire forever rebuilding itself from its own ruins. These were insights the Arthashastra mentioned only in passing, focused as it was on the mechanics of power rather than its purposes. Word of his success reached Pataliputra before he did. When Ashoka returned to the capital, he found that his reputation had shifted. He was no longer merely one prince among many, but a prince who had proven himself capable of wielding authority without destroying what he governed. The emperor acknowledged this with a gesture both subtle and significant. He did not praise his son publicly. That would invite jealousy. But he began to consult him on matters of provincial administration. The favor was incremental, almost invisible, but in a court that passed every gesture for meaning, it registered like the first tremor before an earthquake. Susima watched these developments with growing unease. His own governorship, granted more for show than necessity, had been conducted from comfortable distance. Now his younger brother had returned from a genuine crisis with genuine achievement, and the balance of expectation that had always tilted in his favor began to level. The favored heir did what threatened heirs have done since kings first raised sons. He cultivated allies, reminded the court of his mother's status, and began to position Ashoka's competence as a kind of threat. Too capable, too independent, too willing to act without seeking approval. The court fragmented into factions, as courts always do when succession becomes more than theoretical. Those who backed Susima did so from calculation. He remained the likely heir, and likely heirs reward early loyalty. Those who began to observe Ashoka with new interest did so from a different calculation. The empire required capability, and capability might yet trump birthright. Most kept silent, awaiting clearer signals, knowing that the wrong wager could cost more than position. In this atmosphere of sharpening tension, Bindusara made his next decision. He appointed Ashoka governor of Ujjain, the great city of Avanti province in central India. If Taxila had been a test, Ujjain was a promotion, disguised as exile. The posting removed a capable but threatening prince from the capital, while placing him in a position that demanded both military and administrative skill. Avanti controlled the trade routes connecting northern India to the western ports, and Ujjain stood as its jewel, a city of learning and commerce, where Buddhist monasteries rose beside Hindu temples, and Jain ascetics walked streets crowded with merchants from the coast. The journey south took Ashoka through lands that still bore the scars of his father's conquests. Villages rebuilt from ashes, temples restored after raids, populations resettled after flight. He saw the price of expansion measured not in casualties reported to the capital, but in abandoned wells and broken irrigation channels. The empire had grown vast, yet its growth had not been bloodless. This truth settled into his awareness without yet becoming conviction, like sediment drifting to the bottom of a clear stream. Ujjain welcomed him with the calculated warmth cities reserve for powerful visitors whose favor might prove valuable. The merchant guilds offered gifts, the religious communities sent representatives. The local nobility arranged banquets where wine flowed and dancers performed ancient stories with movements precise as ritual. Through these ceremonies, Ashoka observed and measured, learning to read the city's hidden architecture of power, which families controlled, which trades, where wealth accumulated, whose voices carried weight in the assembly. It was in Vidisha, a town near Ujjain, that destiny wore an unexpected face. Among the merchant families of that prosperous settlement lived a woman named Devi, daughter of a guild master whose wealth came from the overland trade. The chronicles offer few details about her appearance or character, speaking instead of what mattered to imperial recorders: her family's status, her religious inclination, the children she would bear. Yet something in that meeting proved consequential enough that later generations would remember it when they had forgotten the names of queens. Devi was a Buddhist, raised in a faith that spoke of suffering's nature and the path beyond it. In an empire where the court observed Brahmanical ritual and the emperor patronized all creeds with equal political calculation, her commitment represented something quieter than conversion, but deeper than convenience. She attended the teachings of monks who had walked from distant monasteries, sat in assemblies where the Buddha's words were recited and debated, practiced the disciplines of mindfulness that transformed ordinary seeing into insight. Their marriage was a mismatch by court standards, a prince of royal blood to a merchant's daughter, however wealthy. Yet Ujjain was not Pataliputra, and distance permitted freedoms that proximity forbade. The union produced 2 children, a son they named Mahinda and a daughter called Sanghamita. These names would later echo across the seas, carried by missionaries who brought the Dhamma to distant shores. But in the moment of their birth, they were simply children, born to a prince whose future remained uncertain, and a woman whose faith was quiet but unshakable. Through Devi, Ashoka first encountered Buddhist teaching, not as political spectacle or court debate, but as lived practice. She did not proselytize, that would have been unseemly and ineffective, but her presence became a kind of instruction, in the way she approached difficulties without panic, in her treatment of servants as beings worthy of consideration. In the steadiness of her attention, he glimpsed a different way of moving through the world. The seeds planted in those years would lie dormant for decades, waiting for the right soil of circumstance to germinate. Yet these were not years of domestic tranquility alone. As governor of Avanti, Ashoka faced the constant work of administration, adjudicating disputes between merchant guilds, managing the collection of revenues, maintaining the military garrisons that secured the trade routes, balancing the competing demands of different religious communities. He proved capable at each task, neither brilliant nor negligent, building a reputation for measured judgment that filtered back to the capital in the reports of imperial inspectors. The work taught him what ruling actually required, beyond the theoretical frameworks of the Arthashastra. That law meant little without judges who understood local custom, that taxation demanded sensitivity to harvest cycles and market conditions. That military force was most effective when rarely deployed, its mere presence sufficient to prevent the conflicts it existed to resolve. These were lessons earned through practice rather than instruction, stamped into character through repetition. In his 4th year at Ujjain, illness struck. The fever came suddenly, as such afflictions do in climates where monsoon and drought chase each other across the seasons. For weeks he drifted between consciousness and delirium, while Devi tended him with a patience that transformed care into devotion. The city's physicians applied their remedies, herbs and poultices, prayers and sacrifices, while the prince's body fought its own battle against the invisible enemy consuming him from within. He survived, though whether through medicine or constitution or fortune, No one could say with certainty. But survival left its mark. In the long recovery, confined to chambers where time moved differently, he contemplated mortality with an attention that health rarely permits. The episode was not conversion or revelation. Such moments rarely are. But it cracked something in the certainty with which he had moved through the world. For the first time, he understood viscerally what Buddhist teaching proclaimed conceptually, that this body, this life, this moment, all existed in a condition of profound fragility. When strength returned and he resumed his duties, the change was subtle enough that those who served him noticed nothing. Yet something had shifted in the foundation. Like a building settling into earth, the shift was not yet visible in his actions or decisions, but it had begun its work beneath the surface of his awareness. Meanwhile, in Pataliputra, the emperor aged. Bindusara had ruled for a quarter century, extending his father's conquests deeper into the Deccan, maintaining the administrative systems that fed the empire's growth, balancing the endless demands of court and province. But time acknowledged no emperor's authority. His health, once robust, began to fail, with the gradual decline that warns of approaching conclusion. The question that had shadowed every court gathering, who will succeed, sharpened from speculation into urgency. Susima remained in the capital, cultivating influence among the ministers and generals whose support would prove decisive. He had never governed a distant province, never resolved a crisis beyond the reach of immediate reinforcement, never proven himself except through proximity to power. Yet he possessed what Ashoka lacked: a mother whose family commanded resources and loyalty, and the presumption of succession that shaped every calculation. To bet against him was to bet against tradition itself. Ashoka, learning of his father's decline through messages that arrived weeks after events, understood that his time in Ujjain was ending. The question was not whether he would return to Pataliputra, but on whose terms, summoned as a son to pay respects, or compelled as a rival to be eliminated. The difference mattered more than life. He began to prepare, gathering the most loyal of his retainers, quietly securing the allegiance of military commanders in the region, converting his administrative success into the harder currency of armed support. In the winter of 273 BC, a messenger arrived bearing news that every prince had anticipated yet none wished to hear. Emperor Bindusara was dead. The throne of the Mauryan Empire stood empty, and the struggle to fill it would make or break every man who wore royal blood. Ashoka received the message at dusk as lamplight began to push back the gathering dark. He read it twice, then ordered his horse prepared. The road to Pataliputra stretched across hundreds of miles and through the ambitions of everyone who stood between him and the capital. The journey would test more than his endurance. It would determine whether the prince who had learned to govern without terror could seize power through the very methods he had learned to question. The contradiction was not lost on him even then. But empires are not won through philosophical consistency, and succession is a game whose rules are written in blood long before any player takes the field. As he rode through the darkness toward an uncertain crown, the stars wheeled overhead in their ancient patterns, indifferent to the fates of emperors and the ambitions of their sons. Behind him lay Ujjain and the life he had built there: wife, children, achievement. Ahead lay the capital and the struggle that would define him. Between the two stretched only the road and the resolve to follow it wherever it led. The die, as another conqueror once said in another land, was cast. Death opens doors that power had kept locked, and through those doors walk men whose ambitions had been waiting in the shadows. When Bindusara's body was laid upon the funeral pyre, and the flames consumed what remained of his authority, the empire he had governed with methodical patience dissolved into a question that only violence could answer. The court that had spoken with one voice now fractured into a dozen factions, each calculating the odds of survival, each wagering everything on a future that could be measured in days. Tsushima moved first, as the favored heir must. Before the smoke of his father's cremation had cleared the sky above Pataliputra, he was already issuing commands in the emperor's name, a title he assumed without the formal consecration that would make it legitimate. His mother's family rallied their wealth and influence behind him. Ministers who had served Bindusara saw the wisdom of continuity and bent their knees to the son who most resembled the father. The palace guard, crucial in any contest for power, received promises of increased pay and preferment. In the space of 3 days, Tsushima had transformed possibility into apparent inevitability. Yet inevitability is a story men tell themselves until reality revises it. Word reached the capital that Ashoka had left Ujjain, not with the retinue of a son coming to mourn, but with the forces of a commander preparing for war. Behind him rode officers who had served under his governance, soldiers who owed their loyalty to the prince who had led them rather than the distant emperor who had inherited them. The messengers who brought this news also carried reports of other brothers gathering their own forces. Ashoka in the east, others whose names would be lost to history, each sensing that the empire's throne was open to the swift and ruthless. The accounts of what followed blur into legend even as they record what might be truth. Buddhist texts written centuries later, the Ashoka the Mahavamsa, speak of a succession war that lasted 4 years and consumed 99 of Ashoka's brothers, sparing only the youngest, Tissa, whom he kept as advisor rather than victim. The number is likely exaggerated, swollen by time, and the desire of later chroniclers to emphasize the magnitude of transformation that would follow. Yet beneath the embellishment lies a core of violence that no exaggeration could invent, that the transfer of power from Bindusara to his successor was written in blood, that brothers became enemies, that the Mauryan court became a battlefield where loyalty was temporary and survival required ruthlessness. The sources give few details of actual battles, speaking instead in the language of consequence. They tell us that Ashoka earned an epithet during these years, Chandashoka, Ashoka the Fierce, a name that acknowledged the brutality with which he pursued and eliminated rivals. The prince who had resolved the Taxila crisis through negotiation now resolved the succession crisis through methods the Arthashastra prescribed for dealing with threats to state survival, swift, complete, and without sentiment. What we know with greater certainty is this, that the struggle was neither quick nor bloodless, that it required the elimination not merely of rival brothers, but of the factions that supported them, and that when it ended, the court that had once teemed with royal children was reduced to a remnant ruled by one man whose claim rested on victory rather than birthright. The palace that had echoed with the voices of princes fell silent, filled now only with the whispers of those who had survived by choosing the winning side early enough to matter. Behind the violence stood calculation. Radhagupta, a powerful minister whose name appears in the chronicles like a shadow at a threshold, threw his support behind Ashoka. The reasons remain obscure. Perhaps he saw in the Ujjain governor a competence that Tsushima lacked. Perhaps he calculated that a prince formed in the provinces would prove more malleable than one raised in the capital's intrigues. Whatever his motivation, his choice proved decisive. The administrative machinery of the empire, that vast network of officials and spies Chandragupta had built and Bindusara had maintained, required money and coordination to function. With the treasury's keys in sympathetic hands, Ashoka could pay soldiers while his rivals scrambled for funds. The contest's turning point came in the approaches to Pataliputra itself, when Susima's forces met Ashoka's in a confrontation that determined whose banners would fly above the imperial palace. The details have been lost to time's erosion, but the outcome survived. Susima fell, whether in battle or betrayed by his own men. The sources do not agree, and with his death, the last serious challenge to Ashoka's claim collapsed. The remaining brothers either fled to distant provinces where they hoped obscurity might purchase survival, or bent their knees in surrender, offering loyalty in exchange for lives that would be measured now in the new emperor's mercy. Yet victory did not immediately translate to legitimacy. Ashoka had seized power in 273 BC, but his formal consecration, the Abhisheka ceremony, that would transform a successful general into a rightful emperor, did not occur until 269 BC, 4 years, separated conquest from coronation. A gap that speaks to the resistance his accession faced among those who considered lineage more important than capability. During these years, he ruled in fact while lacking the full sanction of ritual, collecting taxes and issuing commands that provincial governors obeyed from necessity rather than conviction. The delay served a purpose. It allowed time for opposition to exhaust itself through futility, for the court to accept what force had established, for the mechanisms of empire to adjust to a new hand on the controls. Ashoka used these years not merely to consolidate military power, but to demonstrate that his rule would function, that the empire would not fragment under a usurper's command, that competence might substitute for the legitimacy of uncontested succession. He reappointed governors who had proven loyal, replaced those whose loyalty remained questionable, and distributed lands and titles to those whose support had been crucial during the succession struggle. Slowly, through the patient work of patronage and pressure, he converted victory into authority. During these years, the character that would later astonish the world remained hidden beneath the necessities of power. The man who had shown restraint in Taxila now showed none in eliminating threats to his throne. The prince who had been tutored in the Arthashastra's methods now applied them with a thoroughness that would have impressed his grandfather. Every potential rival was identified and neutralized. Every noble family whose loyalty remained uncertain was monitored through networks of informants who reported weekly to the capital. Every city gate was watched, every caravan inspected, every whispered conversation in the marketplace assessed for signs of conspiracy. This was governance as Chanakya had conceived it, rule through information, backed by the readiness to employ violence before resistance could organize itself into rebellion. Ashoka rebuilt the spy network that had grown lax under Bindusara's later years, placing trusted officials in every province to serve as the emperor's eyes and ears. He standardized the collection of taxes, ensuring that revenues flowed to the capital rather than disappearing into local coffers. He drilled the military, kept the treasury full, and cultivated the appearance of absolute control, even when that control required constant maintenance. The empire he seized through force was the empire Chandragupta Maurya had carved from chaos and opportunity 60 years earlier. It stretched from the Hindu Kush mountains in the northwest to the forests of Bengal in the east, from the Himalayan foothills in the north to the Deccan Plateau in the south. Nearly 2 million square miles acknowledged Mauryan authority, encompassing a population that numbered in the tens of millions. Farmers who paid their taxes in grain, merchants who paid in silver, artisans whose guild fees filled local treasuries before being passed upward to the capital. The administrative structure that governed this vastness was both sophisticated and fragile. At the empire's heart sat the capital, Pataliputra, where the emperor and his council of ministers, the Mantriparishad, made decisions that rippled outward through layers of officials. Provinces were governed by members of the royal family, or trusted nobles who bore the title of Kumara or Rajuka, administering justice and collecting revenues under the emperor's nominal supervision. Below them operated a hierarchy of district officers, village headmen, and local judges who translated imperial policy into daily reality. The system worked because it had been designed to work by men who understood that empire was not merely conquest, but administration, not merely force, but routine. Standardized weights and measures ensured that a merchant in Taxila could trade with confidence in Pataliputra. A network of roads connected distant provinces, maintained by corvée labor extracted from villages in lieu of taxation. Rest houses offered shelter to travelers. Wells dug at regular intervals provided water. Marker stones counted distance in units that made journey planning possible. This was the infrastructure of power, unglamorous but essential, the skeleton upon which empire's flesh was laid. The military, too, reflected Mauryan organizational genius. Greek sources, drawing on reports from Megasthenes, who had served as Seleucid ambassador decades earlier, spoke of standing armies that numbered in the hundreds of thousands, 600,000 infantry, 30,000 cavalry, 9,000 war elephants. The numbers were likely inflated by awe and imperfect intelligence, yet they captured a truth: that the Mauryan Empire maintained a military force larger and better organized than any other power in the subcontinent's history. Soldiers received regular pay from the treasury, trained in specialized units, and served under officers whose advancement depended on competence rather than merely on birth. The religious landscape remained as diverse as Bindusara had left it. Ashoka, despite whatever private inclinations Devi's influence might have planted, followed his father's policy of public pluralism. He made donations to Brahmin priests, supported Jain ascetics, patronized Ajivika teachers, and honored Buddhist monasteries. To do otherwise would have been politically foolish, inviting the alienation of communities whose cooperation the empire required. The early years of his reign offered no hint of the transformation that would later define him. He appeared to all observers as simply another Mauryan emperor, capable, ruthless, and devoted to the pragmatic exercise of power. Yet one question remained unresolved, one gap in the empire's dominion that had vexed both Chandragupta and Bindusara: the kingdom of Kalinga. Occupying the eastern coast along the Bay of Bengal, Kalinga had maintained its independence through a combination of military strength and diplomatic skill. Its ports controlled the maritime trade routes connecting India to Southeast Asia. Its territories produced wealth that funded armies capable of deterring Mauryan expansion. Successive emperors had considered conquering Kalinga and decided the cost exceeded the benefit. The kingdom remained a gap in the map, a reminder that even the Mauryan Empire had limits. During his consolidation years, Ashoka made no move against Kalinga. He was occupied with securing what he had seized, transforming contested authority into undisputed command. But the gap remained, visible on every map consulted in the palace, discussed in every council meeting that addressed trade policy or military deployment. The conquest his grandfather had begun and his father had continued remained incomplete. An incompleteness in an empire is like a sentence without punctuation. It demands resolution. By 269 BC, when the priests finally performed the Abhisheka ceremony and Ashoka was consecrated as rightful emperor, the succession crisis had faded into memory. Those who remembered his rise through violence had learned not to mention it. The court that had once whispered rebellion now competed for his favor. The empire that had trembled on the edge of fragmentation had steadied under a hand that knew when to strike and when to hold. The new emperor sat on a throne, made legitimate by ritual, but secured by methods the ritual carefully omitted from mention. He was 35 years old, seasoned by governance and hardened by war. He had learned to read men's intentions in their gestures and their fears in their silences. He had mastered the disciplines the Arthashastra taught, that power requires constant vigilance, that mercy must be measured against necessity, that an emperor survives by never forgetting that those who serve him today might betray him tomorrow. He was, in every way that mattered to those who observed him, what the empire required: strong, competent, and willing to do what succession and survival demanded. The Buddhist texts that would later chronicle his life describe these years with an epithet that carries the weight of moral judgment: Ashoka, the fierce one. They present this period as darkness that makes the later light more brilliant, violence that makes the later peace more profound. Yet to those who lived through it, the darkness was simply power operating as power must, eliminating threats, consolidating authority, converting chaos into order through methods as old as civilization itself. Ashoka stood now at the height of command, master of an empire that stretched across the subcontinent. Before him lay the work of governance, the constant negotiation between force and consent that keeps vast territories bound to a single will. He had proven himself capable of seizing power. Now he would prove whether he could wield it. The question of Kalinga remained on the horizon, waiting for the moment when incomplete conquest would become intolerable, when the gap in the map would demand to be filled. That moment was approaching, carried forward by the logic of empire and the ambition of emperors. The transformation that would change everything, that would turn the fierce conqueror into the philosopher king, the ruthless victor into the remorseful sage, waited still, hidden in a future that seemed to promise only more of what had come before. For now, the court celebrated, the provinces obeyed, and the emperor who had waded through blood to reach his throne settled into the business of rule, not yet knowing that his greatest victory would become his deepest wound, and that wound would remake not only his soul, but the spiritual destiny of half the world. The lamps burned late in the palace of Pataliputra, illuminating maps where cartographers traced the empire's borders. In one corner, unmarked by Mauryan authority, Kalinga waited, prosperous, independent, and unaware that its fate had already been written. In the calculations of an emperor who had learned that nothing concentrates an empire's attention quite like the territory it does not yet command. An empire secured through violence must justify itself through order. An order, once established, demands expansion to prove its strength. In the years following his consecration, Ashoka set about transforming his contested authority into undisputed command, not through proclamation, but through the patient work of governance. The emperor who had seized power through methods the court preferred to forget, now demonstrated that power could be maintained through methods the court could celebrate. Justice administered, infrastructure built, prosperity encouraged, and borders secured against those who might test the empire's resolve. The early years of his formal reign unfolded in the rhythms of administrative consolidation. In the palace at Pataliputra, the machinery of empire turned with renewed precision. The Council of Ministers met regularly to review reports from provincial governors, assess tax revenues, and adjudicate disputes that local officials could not resolve. Ashoka presided over these councils not as distant sovereign, but as active participant, questioning assessments, challenging recommendations, and demanding accountability from men accustomed to exercising authority with minimal oversight. Those who had grown comfortable during Bindusara's later years discovered that the new emperor possessed neither his father's patience nor his willingness to delegate without supervision. The judicial system, that essential framework through which empires translate power into legitimacy, received particular attention. Ashoka appointed Rajakas, district officers who served as traveling judges, moving from village to hear cases and render verdicts according to imperial law. These officials replaced the patchwork of local customs and tribal traditions with standardized procedures that applied equally, whether a man stood accused in the shadow of the Himalayas or on the coast of the Arabian Sea. The principle was simple and revolutionary: that justice should not vary with geography, that the emperor's law extended to every subject, regardless of distance from the capital. Yet standardization required more than proclamation. It demanded infrastructure. Along the great roads that connected provinces, Ashoka ordered the construction of rest houses where travelers could shelter and his officials could hold court. Wells were dug at regular intervals, their water freely available to all who passed. Shade trees were planted, mango groves and banyan stands that would take decades to mature, their benefit intended for generations unborn. This was governance conceived as gardening. One plants knowing that the harvest will come long after the planter's hand has returned to dust. Agricultural improvement became a priority. The empire's wealth rested ultimately on the productivity of its farmers, those millions who worked the land and paid their taxes in grain. Ashoka's administration surveyed irrigation systems, repaired canals that had fallen into disrepair, and funded the construction of new reservoirs to capture monsoon rains for use during the dry season. Where previous emperors had extracted wealth, he invested in its production, understanding that an empire's strength could be measured in the fullness of its granaries, as surely as in the sharpness of its swords. Trade flourished under the security his governance provided. Merchants who had hidden their wealth during the succession crisis now brought it forth to finance caravans that traversed the empire's length. From the northwest came horses bred in the Central Asian steppes, lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, and goods that had traveled the Silk Roads from kingdoms so distant their names sounded like legends. From the south arrived pearls and precious stones, sandalwood and spices, textiles woven with patterns that required months to complete. Through the customs houses flowed revenues that filled the imperial treasury, and with that wealth came the capacity to reward loyalty, punish rebellion, and maintain the military forces that guaranteed the peace in which commerce thrived. The army, though reduced from its wartime strength, remained formidable. Ashoka maintained garrisons in every province, rotating troops to prevent the formation of local loyalties that might supersede allegiance to the emperor. He invested in training, ensuring that soldiers drilled regularly in the tactics and formations that had made Mauryan forces dominant. War elephants, those living engines of terror that could break enemy lines through sheer mass and fury, were bred and trained in royal stables. The cavalry practiced maneuvers across open ground, learning to wheel and charge with precision. The infantry, backbone of any army, learned to fight in formations that could adapt to terrain and circumstance. Yet Ashoka deployed this military strength sparingly during his early reign. He was not his grandfather, driven by the hunger to conquer, nor entirely his father, content with methodical expansion. He seemed instead focused on consolidating what the empire already possessed, on transforming conquered territories into integrated provinces. where Mauryan rule felt inevitable rather than imposed. The borders remained mostly quiet, tested occasionally by raids from tribes beyond the frontier, but never seriously threatened by organized resistance. In matters of faith, he continued the policy of calculated pluralism that had served his predecessors. Royal patronage flowed to religious communities of every persuasion, gold to renovate Brahmin temples, land grants to support Jain monasteries, endowments for Ajivika ascetics, donations to Buddhist sanghas. The emperor appeared at religious festivals, made offerings at appropriate shrines, and spoke respectfully of all traditions. To the priests and monks who benefited from his generosity, this seemed like genuine piety. To the court officials who managed the disbursements, it was governance, the binding of diverse communities to the throne through the universal language of patronage. Behind this public neutrality, however, the seeds Devi had planted years earlier in Ujjain continued their slow germination. Ashoka had not forgotten the Buddhist teachings she had lived rather than preached. The emphasis on reducing suffering, the practice of mindfulness, the doctrine that craving was the root of human misery. These ideas remained in his awareness without yet commanding his conviction, like seeds lying dormant in soil, waiting for the right conditions to sprout. His personal life during these years remains obscured by the chronicler's focus on public events. Devi and their children remained in Ujjain, far from the capital's intrigues. He had taken other wives, as emperors must, marriage being a tool of alliance as much as affection. Among them was a Sandimitra, who held the position of chief queen, the Agramahisi, representing the traditional bonds between throne and nobility. There was Karuvaki, mother of his son Tivala, memorialized later in an edict that speaks of his affection. And there was Tishyaraksha, whose name appears in Buddhist texts as hostile to the Dhamma, though whether this reflects historical reality or sectarian invention remains uncertain. The court itself had settled into the routines of established power. The violence of the succession had faded into careful forgetfulness. Mentioned only in whispers, and never in the emperor's presence, those who had supported him rose to positions of influence. Those who had opposed him quietly withdrew from public life, or found themselves assigned to distant posts where their discontent could not organize itself into resistance. The nobility learned the new rules, that competence mattered more than lineage, that loyalty was measured in results rather than rhetoric, and that the emperor's favor was earned daily and could be withdrawn instantly. Yet beneath this surface of order and prosperity, Ashoka remained what the succession had made him, a ruler who understood that power required constant vigilance, that threats emerged from unexpected quarters, and that an emperor who showed weakness invited the very challenges he hoped to avoid. The Arthashastra's lessons remained his guide. Maintain networks of informants, reward loyalty generously, punish disloyalty swiftly, and never allow sentiment to cloud judgment. This was not cruelty for its own sake, but calculation born of experience. The knowledge that empires fall when emperors forget that human nature prefers advantage to virtue. As the years accumulated, his administration achieved what every government seeks but few attain: the transformation of conscious effort into automatic function. Tax collection became routine, justice predictable, security assumed. Farmers planted their crops, knowing the harvest would not be plundered by bandits or rival armies. Merchants loaded their caravans, confident that the roads would be passable and the customs duties consistent. Travelers journeyed from one end of the empire to the other, witnessing the variety of its peoples and the unity of its governance, marveling that so vast a territory could be ruled from a single capital. This was the peace that power purchases, not the absence of coercion, but its successful concealment. Not the elimination of force, but its efficient application. The empire functioned smoothly because its mechanisms had been well designed and were now well maintained. Ashoka presided over this machinery with the confidence of a craftsman who understands his tools, adjusting here, tightening there, replacing parts that showed signs of wear before they could fail and cause larger breakdowns. But empires, like men, are rarely content with maintenance. The very efficiency that characterized Ashoka's governance created its own momentum, a sense that the state's capabilities should be deployed rather than merely preserved. The military that trained constantly needed battlefields to validate its training. The administrative system that had perfected the integration of conquered territories needed new territories to integrate. The ideology of universal rule that justified Mauryan expansion required that expansion continue until it encompassed all that could be encompassed. And there, on the eastern coast, visible on every map consulted in the palace, lay the gap that had vexed 2 generations of Mauryan emperors. Kalinga. The kingdom occupied approximately 60,000 square miles of territory along the Bay of Bengal, its borders defined by rivers and defended by armies that had thus far deterred Mauryan ambition. Its capital, Tosali, served as a major port through which passed the maritime trade connecting India to the kingdoms of Southeast Asia. The revenues this commerce generated funded a military establishment capable of resisting conquest, and for decades, that capability had been sufficient to maintain independence. Kalinga's prosperity was visible to anyone who travelled the coast. Its cities bustled with merchants from distant lands. Its temples displayed the wealth that successful trade produces. Its fields, watered by well-maintained irrigation systems, yielded harvests that fed a population numbering in the millions. The kingdom had developed its own administrative traditions, its own legal systems, its own sense of identity that made it not merely independent but consciously separate from the Mauryan sphere. To incorporate Kalinga would be to complete the unification of the subcontinent, to achieve what Chandragupta had begun and Bindusara had advanced, but neither had finished. The strategic arguments for conquest were compelling. Kalinga's ports gave it control over maritime routes that Mauryan merchants could access only by paying duties to a foreign power. Its territory formed a wedge between the empire's eastern provinces and its potential expansion southward. Its independence served as an example to other kingdoms that might calculate that resistance could succeed where submission would not. Every council meeting that addressed trade policy or military deployment eventually returned to the same question. How long could the empire tolerate a gap in its dominion? Yet conquest required justification beyond mere desire. Ashoka was not a reckless aggressor. His early reign had demonstrated a preference for consolidation over expansion. The decision to attack Kalinga would need to rest on grounds that satisfied not only strategic calculation, but the political necessity of presenting war as something other than naked ambition. Throughout 262 BC, as the question moved from abstract consideration to concrete planning, the emperor and his ministers constructed the case for war. The chronicles offer different explanations for the decision. Some suggest that Kalinga had provided sanctuary to enemies of the Mauryan state, refugees from the succession war who plotted return and revenge. Others mention trade disputes, customs conflicts, or border incidents that escalated from local grievances into matters of imperial honor. The truth likely combined elements of each, that multiple factors accumulated until they reached a threshold where war seemed not merely desirable but necessary, where the costs of continued tolerance appeared to exceed the costs of conquest. By the time monsoon rains ended in late 262 BC, The decision had been made. The army would march east in the following year's campaign season. Ashoka ordered his commanders to begin preparations. Troops drilled in the tactics required for fighting in coastal terrain. Siege equipment was constructed and tested. Supply trains were organized to support an army operating far from its home bases. The machinery of war, so long maintained in readiness, now shifted into active deployment. In the palace, scribes copied orders and dispatched them to provincial governors. Levies of troops from each region, requisitions of grain and fodder, demands for the specialized equipment, ropes and timber, iron and leather, that armies consume in vast quantities. The empire that had seemed so peaceful beneath the surface of administrative routine now revealed the militarized foundation upon which that peace rested. Every farmer who paid his taxes had contributed to this moment. Every merchant whose caravan traveled safely had funded it. Every village that had welcomed the emperor's justice had helped build the force that would now march to impose that justice on those who had never requested it. As winter approached and the campaign season drew near, Ashoka reviewed his forces and found them ready. The decision had been made, the preparations completed, the justifications constructed. What lay ahead seemed simply the application of overwhelming force to achieve inevitable outcome. The conquest of Kalinga would be remembered, if it was remembered at all, as merely another in the long series of Mauryan victories. A footnote in the empire's expansion, a gap on the map finally filled. No one, not the emperor, not his generals, not the priests who blessed the coming campaign, imagined that the victory they anticipated would become the wound that would transform everything, that the conquest of Kalinga would be not an ending, but a beginning, not a triumph, but a revelation, not the consolidation of power, but the questioning of power's very purpose. The maps were marked, the orders issued, the army assembled. As the year 261 BC opened, Ashoka prepared to march east toward a battlefield that would change not only the borders of his empire, but the boundaries of his soul. The path to Kalinga lay clear before him, and down that path he would walk into a transformation that no one, least of all himself, could have foreseen. The empire held its breath. History waited, and in the distant kingdom that stood between independence and conquest, ordinary life continued. Farmers tended fields, merchants haggled in marketplaces, families gathered for evening meals, unaware that their world was about to meet a force that would alter it forever, and in altering it, would alter the very nature of the power that sought to claim it. There are victories that conquer kingdoms, and victories that conquer the conqueror. The campaign that began in the dry season of 261 BC would achieve both, though none who marched from Pataliputra that spring imagined that the transformation awaiting them would be measured not in territory gained, but in certainty lost. The army that departed was magnificent in its confidence, disciplined in its movements, and certain of its purpose. The emperor who led it had known only success since seizing his throne. The gap on the map would be filled, the unfinished conquest completed, and the empire made whole. Kalinga occupied the coastal plains, where great rivers met the Bay of Bengal, a kingdom carved from land made fertile by annual floods and enriched by maritime commerce. Its boundaries stretched approximately from the Mahanadi River in the north to the Godavari in the south, encompassing forests and farmland, cities and villages, a population that had developed its own distinct identity over centuries of independence. The kingdom's wealth was visible in the architecture of Tosali, its capital, temples adorned with intricate carvings, marketplaces where merchants traded goods from lands across the eastern seas, administrative buildings that spoke of a government both sophisticated and stable. The Kalingan military tradition, was as old as the kingdom itself. Its soldiers were not conscripts dragged unwillingly from their fields, but warriors who had trained for generations in the defense of their homeland. They understood the terrain, the river crossings that could become death traps during monsoon, the forest paths that could hide ambush, the coastal marshes that swallowed armies unfamiliar with their treachery. They possessed, too, something less tangible but equally powerful: the conviction that they fought not for distant emperor, but for homes they could see, families they could name, a way of life that submission would erase. When word reached Tosali that Mauryan armies were gathering on the western frontier, King Anantha Padmanabhan, whose name survives in fragmentary sources, ordered mobilization. Every district sent its levies, every noble his retainers, every garrison its trained soldiers. The Kalingan forces assembled not with the casual confidence of those who have never known defeat, but with the grim determination of those who understand exactly what they stand to lose. They fortified the river crossings, stockpiled provisions in their cities, and prepared to defend every mile of territory with the desperation that makes defensive warfare so costly to attackers. The Mauryan army that crossed into Kalinga was unlike anything the kingdom had faced before. Ashoka commanded forces drawn from across his empire: infantry from the Gangetic plains, cavalry from the northwest, archers from the Deccan, and war elephants whose trumpeting could be heard for miles. The logistics of moving such an army were staggering. Tens of thousands of men, thousands of animals, supply trains that stretched for miles along roads that sometimes existed only as cleared paths through forest. Yet the Mauryan administrative system, honed through decades of military campaigns, managed the complexity with practiced efficiency. The specific details of battles have been lost to time's erosion. No chronicler preserved accounts of troop movements or tactical decisions. What survived instead was the outcome, recorded by Ashoka himself years later in Rock Edict 13, carved in stone across his empire as testimony to what happened when ambition met resistance and victory revealed itself as catastrophe. The numbers he provided, whether precise accounting or rhetorical emphasis, captured the scale of destruction: 100,000 killed in battle, 150,000 deported, and many times that number dead from war's indirect consequences. The campaign unfolded across months, not days. The Kalingans did not offer a single decisive battle that Mauryan superiority could overwhelm. Instead, they fought with the stubbornness of those defending everything they possessed. They contested river crossings, forcing the Mauryans to build pontoon bridges under arrow fire. They ambushed supply columns in forested regions where elephants could not maneuver. They retreated to fortified cities and forced sieges that consumed weeks. Each victory the Mauryans achieved required blood to purchase it, and the price accumulated until even victory began to resemble defeat. The elephants that had seemed so formidable became liabilities in coastal terrain. The forests channeled them into killing zones where Kalingan archers could strike without facing direct assault. The heat and humidity of the coastal lowlands sapped strength from soldiers accustomed to drier climates. Disease spread through the camps: dysentery, fever, infections that turned minor wounds into fatal complications. The Mauryan commanders adapted, modified their tactics, and pressed forward with the grim persistence that characterized their empire's military tradition. But adaptation came at cost, measured in lives that could not be recovered. As the campaign ground toward its conclusion, the character of the war changed. What had begun as military conquest became destruction. Villages that might have served as bases for resistance were burned to prevent their use. Fields were trampled or deliberately destroyed to deny resources to enemy forces. The population that had not fled before the advancing army found itself trapped between competing forces, suffering from both combat and the disruptions it caused. The irrigation systems that had made the land prosperous were broken. The markets that had sustained commerce fell silent. When Tosali finally fell, resistance did not end, but fractured into isolated pockets that required months more to suppress. The conquest was total and terrible, achieving its objective while destroying much of what made that objective valuable. The Mauryan banners flew above Kalinga's cities, but those cities now stood half empty, their populations scattered or subjugated, their prosperity converted into ruin that would require years to rebuild. Tradition holds that Ashoka walked the battlefield after the final organized resistance had been crushed. The sources do not describe this scene in detail, leaving later generations to imagine what he saw. The dead lying where they had fallen, the wounded crying for water or mercy, the smoke from burned villages rising in columns that merged with storm clouds gathering on the horizon. Whether he walked such a field, or whether the confrontation happened within the palace at Tosali, surrounded by reports and casualty lists, matters less than what followed, that something broke or opened in his understanding, that the victory he had pursued revealed itself as loss even as it was achieved. Rock Edict 13, inscribed years later, but reflecting on this moment, speaks with unusual directness for an official imperial document. The beloved of the gods feels remorse on account of the conquest of Kalinga. It begins using the imperial title while acknowledging an emperor's grief. The edict continues with language that seems to struggle against the limits of what can be spoken in stone. For when an independent country is conquered, the slaughter, death, and deportation of people is extremely grievous and weighs heavily on the mind of the beloved of the gods. The text elaborates with a specificity that official documents normally avoid. Even those who are fortunate to have escaped and whose love is undiminished suffer from the misfortunes of their friends, acquaintances, colleagues, and relatives. This participation of all men in suffering weighs heavily on the mind of the beloved of the gods. Here was an emperor acknowledging not merely the deaths of soldiers, but the suffering of survivors, the rupture of communities, the grief that extends beyond battlefields into homes and families. What produced this response? The Arthashastra offered no framework for remorse. Its logic moved from means to ends, without pausing to question whether ends justified. Means Chandragupta had conquered without recorded regret. Bindusara had expanded the empire through methods that differed from Ashoka's only in scale. Yet something in the Kalinga campaign, its cost, its character, its revelation of what conquest actually required, penetrated the armor of imperial necessity and reached the man beneath. Perhaps it was the sheer magnitude of suffering concentrated in a single campaign. Perhaps it was the contrast between the abstraction of strategy, discussed in council chambers, and the reality of bodies broken on fields made mud by blood and rain. Perhaps it was the memory of Devi's teachings, dormant for years but never truly forgotten, now awakened by circumstances that demonstrated what Buddhist doctrine proclaimed, that craving leads to suffering, that violence perpetuates violence, that the cycle continues until someone chooses to step away from it. Or perhaps it was something simpler and more profound, that Ashoka, having achieved everything the logic of empire demanded, discovered that achievement felt like failure, that the gap on the map had been filled, but the gap in meaning had only widened, that he had gained a kingdom and lost something he had not known he possessed until its absence made itself felt. The transformation was not instantaneous. Men do not abandon lifetimes of training and conviction in a single moment of revelation. But something essential had shifted, like tectonic plates moving beneath the surface of consciousness, generating tremors that would take time to manifest, but whose eventual effects would reshape the landscape completely. The emperor who departed Kalinga in late 261 BSC was outwardly the same man who had entered it months earlier, victorious, powerful, master of an empire that now stretched unbroken from the Hindu Kush to the Bay of Bengal. Yet inwardly, a question had begun to form, one that would prove more transformative than any conquest. If this is what victory requires, what is victory worth? The army marched home through territories now secured by Mauryan garrisons. Supply lines that had carried weapons and provisions eastward now carried wounded soldiers and captured plunder westward. The elephants that had survived the campaign returned to their stables, the cavalry to their posts, the infantry to their barracks or farms. Officers received rewards for their service. Soldiers shared plunder taken from the conquered kingdom. The machinery of empire absorbed the victory and continued functioning as machinery must, processing the outcome without questioning its meaning. But in the emperor's mind, a different processing had begun. He did not announce it, did not proclaim transformation, did not immediately alter policy or practice. The court that gathered upon his return saw only what it expected. A victorious emperor returned from completing his grandfather's unfinished work, adding the final territory that made the Mauryan Empire truly continental in scope. They celebrated as courts celebrate victory, with banquets and ceremonies, with priests offering sacrifices of gratitude, with poets composing verses that would describe the conquest in language that converted violence into glory. Ashoka participated in these rituals, performing the role of victorious emperor, because that role was what the moment required and what his position demanded. Yet something in him had withdrawn from full participation, as if part of his awareness now watched from outside, observing the celebration with the detachment of someone who has seen what lies beneath victory's surface and can no longer entirely believe in its beauty. Kalinga became a Mauryan province, administered by governors appointed from Pataliputra, taxed according to imperial rates, garrisoned by troops rotated from other regions. The systems of integration that the empire had perfected through generations of conquest were applied once more, transforming independent kingdom into subordinate territory. The work proceeded efficiently, demonstrating that whatever personal crisis Ashoka experienced, the machinery of empire continued functioning without requiring his full conviction to operate. Yet the emperor himself was changing in ways not immediately visible to those around him. He withdrew increasingly into private reflection, spending hours in chambers where only trusted attendants were permitted. He summoned Buddhist monks for conversations that extended late into the night, asking questions that moved beyond the formal protocols of royal patronage into genuine inquiry about suffering's nature and the possibility of its cessation. He did not yet commit himself publicly to Buddhist teaching. Political calculations still operated, warning that too sudden a shift would alarm the court and alienate communities the empire needed to govern. But privately, the seeds Devi had planted years earlier now found soil prepared by experience to receive them. The victory was complete. The empire was whole. The map no longer showed gaps in Mauryan authority. Yet the emperor who had achieved this completeness discovered that completeness itself was incomplete, that the conquest of territory left unconquered the question of meaning, that the Arthashastra's logic of power provided no answer to the question that Kalinga had forced him to confront. What use is mastery of the world if mastery requires the destruction of what makes the world worth ruling? As the year turned and the seasons cycled through their familiar patterns, Ashoka stood at a threshold, he had not known existed until he crossed it. Behind him lay the path of conquest, clear and well-traveled, validated by his grandfather's example and his father's practice. Ahead lay a path only dimly visible, obscured by uncertainty and opposed by everything his training had taught him to value. Between the two paths stood a question that would not be silenced by victory or distracted by celebration. If not this, then what? The answer would come, slowly at first, then with gathering conviction. But the transformation it would bring had already begun in the silence of a battlefield, in the weight of numbers carved in stone, in the remorse of an emperor who had won everything and discovered that everything was not enough. Kalinga had been conquered, but in conquering it, Ashoka had encountered something that conquered him. The recognition that power, however absolute, cannot escape the moral questions it generates, and that some victories are won only by surrendering what one thought victory meant. The dust of the campaign settled. The wounded healed or died. The displaced began the slow work of rebuilding shattered lives. And in the palace at Pataliputra, an emperor sat alone with his thoughts, staring at maps that showed an empire complete but a future uncertain, wondering what transformation had begun and where it would lead, knowing only that the man who had marched to Kalinga was not quite the same as the man who had returned, and that the difference, however subtle, would prove more consequential than all the territory that difference had cost to secure. There are doors that open slowly, almost imperceptibly, until one morning you wake to find yourself in a room you did not know existed. The transformation that began on the fields of Kalinga continued in the quieter precincts of consciousness, where conviction shifts like sand beneath receding water, where certainty dissolves into questions that refuse simple answers. Ashoka did not abandon power. He remained emperor, commander of armies, master of an empire that stretched across the subcontinent. But the meaning of that power had begun to change, and with it, the purposes to which it would be directed. In the months following his return from Kalinga, the emperor withdrew from the elaborate ceremonies that had defined court life. Where he had once presided over banquets that lasted until dawn, he now excused himself after perfunctory appearances. Where he had welcomed the flattery of courtiers competing for favor, he now seemed impatient with praise that measured achievement only in territory gained. Those who had known him longest detected a shift they could not quite articulate. A distraction, perhaps, or a preoccupation, as if part of his attention had turned inward to a conversation the court could not hear. He began to seek out Buddhist monks with a frequency that went beyond the routine patronage all emperors extended to religious communities. Where previous visits had been formal occasions marked by ritual donation and ceremonial blessing, these new encounters took on a different character. Ashoka asked questions. He listened. He requested explanations of teachings that probed beyond the surface of doctrine into the experiential claims Buddhism made about the nature of suffering and the possibility of its cessation. The monks who attended him noted something unusual. Here was an emperor genuinely seeking understanding, rather than merely collecting the merit that generosity to religious communities was believed to produce. The teaching he encountered was not the elaborate philosophical system Buddhism would later become, but something closer to the Buddha's original emphasis on practical liberation from suffering. The Four Noble Truths provided a framework that suffering exists, that it arises from craving and attachment, that it can cease, and that the path to its cessation requires ethical conduct, mental discipline, and wisdom. The Eightfold Path outlined practices: right view, right intention, right speech, right action, right livelihood, right effort, right mindfulness, right concentration, that transformed abstract understanding into lived experience. For a man trained in the Arthashastra's pragmatic calculation of power, Buddhist teaching offered a different kind of pragmatism, not how to control others, but how to control oneself, not how to maximize advantage, but how to minimize the suffering that advantage seeking produces. The doctrine of ahimsa, non-violence toward all living beings, stood in direct opposition to everything his military training had valorized. Yet it resonated with something the Kalinga campaign had awakened: the recognition that violence, even when successful, creates consequences that extend far beyond its immediate objectives. The historical record suggests this engagement with Buddhism was gradual rather than sudden. Minor rock Edict Waon, inscribed later, provides testimony to the timeline. Ashoka states that he had been a lay Buddhist for more than 2.5 years without making much progress, but that it was now over a year since he had drawn closer to the Sangha and become more ardent in practice. The numbers indicate a process: initial adoption around 259 BC, deepening commitment around 258 BC, between Kalinga's conquest in 261 and full engagement around 257, 2 to 4 years passed. Years of inquiry, doubt, resistance, and gradual acceptance. This timeline matters because it reveals transformation as process rather than event. Ashoka did not wake one morning as a Buddhist emperor, having gone to sleep as a conventional ruler. He moved through stages: intellectual curiosity, emotional resonance, tentative practice, growing conviction, and finally public commitment. Each stage involved negotiation with the habits of thought and action that his earlier life had established. To embrace Buddhism fully meant questioning everything the Arthashastra had taught, everything his grandfather's example had validated, everything the machinery of empire assumed about power's necessary exercise. Yet even as his private practice deepened, his public role required continuity. The empire did not pause for its emperor's spiritual crisis. Provinces still required governance. Taxes still needed collection. Justice still demanded administration. Ashoka continued to fulfill these functions, but the lens through which he viewed them was changing. Where he had once seen power as an end, requiring force to secure, he began to see it as a tool that could be wielded for purposes other than its own perpetuation. Where he had once accepted that governance required violence as foundation, he began to imagine that violence might be minimized if not entirely eliminated. The concept that would define his mature reign was beginning to take shape during these years: Dhamma. The word itself derived from the Sanskrit Dharma, carrying connotations of righteousness, duty, and cosmic order. But Ashoka would give it a meaning specifically his own. His Dhamma was not identical to Buddhist doctrine, though it drew heavily from Buddhist ethics. It was not a new religion, though it carried religious weight. It was instead an attempt to articulate a set of principles that could guide both personal conduct and imperial policy. Principles that emphasized compassion over cruelty, self-restraint over indulgence, tolerance over sectarianism, and the welfare of all beings over the advantage of the powerful. This developing philosophy required teachers. Among them, the figure of Moggaliputta Tissa emerges from the chronicles as a senior monk, whose learning and integrity made him suitable guide for an emperor seeking wisdom. The historical evidence for their relationship is thin but persistent. Later sources describe Moggaliputta Tissa as instrumental in deepening Ashoka's understanding of Buddhist teaching and in organizing the missionary activities that would eventually carry Buddhism beyond India's borders. Whether the specifics are accurate matters less than the pattern they suggest: that Ashoka sought instruction from those more advanced in practice, that he approached Buddhism not as imperial patron, but as serious student. During this period of internal transformation, Ashoka undertook pilgrimages to sites associated with the Buddha's life. The practice of visiting sacred locations was not new. Pilgrimage had been part of Indian religious life for centuries. But the emperor's journeys carried political as well as spiritual significance. He travelled to Lumbini, where the Buddha was said to have been born, and erected a pillar marking the location. He visited Bodh Gaya, where enlightenment had occurred beneath a pipal tree, and made offerings that combined imperial grandeur with genuine devotion. He went to Sarnath, where the first sermon had been delivered, and to Kushinagar, where the Buddha had died. These pilgrimages served multiple purposes. They demonstrated the emperor's commitment to Buddhist practice, legitimizing his emerging identity as defender of the Dhamma. They brought imperial attention and resources to sites that were important to Buddhist communities, but had not previously enjoyed state patronage. They allowed Ashoka to connect personally with the narrative of the Buddha's life, walking paths the teacher had walked, seeing landscapes he had seen, experiencing in some small measure the world that had produced the teaching, now transforming an empire. Yet the transformation remained, during these years, primarily internal and relatively private. The court continued to function according to established patterns. Religious pluralism remained official policy. Ashoka still made donations to Brahmin priests, still honoured Jain ascetics, still supported Ajivika teachers. He had not yet announced publicly that Buddhism would receive special status, had not yet begun the systematic promotion of Dhamma that would characterize his later reign. This caution reflected both political calculation and genuine uncertainty. He was finding his way through territory for which no map existed. How could an emperor dedicated to non-violence govern an empire built on conquest? How could power be wielded ethically when power itself depended on the threat of force? His family life during this transformation remains largely obscured. Devi and their children in Ujjain must have observed the change with recognition. She had introduced him to Buddhist teaching years earlier, and now the seeds she had planted were finally bearing fruit. His other wives in Pataliputra likely viewed his growing devotion with varying degrees of understanding or alarm. The court nobles who had risen to power during the succession struggle must have wondered whether an emperor devoted to non-violence represented security or vulnerability. Yet Ashoka managed these relationships with enough skill that no significant opposition to his emerging commitment materialized during this period. The military, always a critical constituency in any empire's stability, posed a particular challenge. Soldiers who had fought in Kalinga and earlier campaigns had done so under the assumption that conquest validated their sacrifice and violence served noble ends. An emperor who now questioned violence itself risked alienating the very force that guaranteed his authority. Yet Ashoka did not disband the army or announce that warfare was forever renounced. He maintained the military establishment while beginning to articulate a vision in which force would be used only defensively, in which conquest was replaced by Dhamma conquest, the spread of righteous principles through persuasion rather than coercion. By 257 BC, approximately 4 years after Kalinga, the transformation had progressed sufficiently that Ashoka was ready to begin its public expression. The private study and personal practice that had marked the intervening years now prepared to manifest as policy and proclamation. The emperor who had questioned himself in silence was preparing to announce those questions and tentative answers to an empire accustomed to certainty. The shift from warrior king to Dharma king was beginning to externalize itself in ways that would reshape not only how he governed, but what governance meant. The process by which internal conviction becomes external action is rarely straightforward. Ideas must be translated into institutions, principles into policies, spiritual insights into administrative directives. The machinery of empire that Ashoka had inherited was designed to project power and extract resources. To bend it toward different purposes, toward compassion, welfare, and moral instruction, would require not merely new intentions, but new structures. The work of transformation was shifting from the realm of consciousness into the realm of stone, law, and edict. Yet even as preparation for public announcement proceeded, uncertainty remained. Could an empire survive on principles that contradicted the logic of its founding? Could soldiers raised on glory adapt to restraint? Could provincial governors trained in extraction learn to prioritize welfare? Could an emperor who had waded through blood to reach his throne credibly proclaim that violence should be minimized? The questions multiplied faster than the answers, yet the commitment deepened. Something essential had changed in Ashoka's understanding of what power was for, and that change would not permit return to the old certainties, however comfortable they had been. The monsoon rains came and went, marking the passage of seasons and the accumulation of conviction. In the palace gardens, Ashoka walked paths lined with flowering trees, their blossoms opening and falling in cycles that continued regardless of human concerns. In the meditation halls, where he now spent increasing time, the practice of mindfulness revealed how thoroughly conditioned his responses had become, how automatically aggression arose, how habitually grasping manifested, how deeply the patterns of self and empire had intertwined. The work of untangling them was the work of years, yet it had begun. Around him, the empire continued its routines, vast and intricate, a human construction that had taken on a life of its own. Markets opened at dawn and closed at dusk. Farmers planted and harvested according to seasons older than memory. Caravans crossed deserts carrying goods between regions that would never meet except through commerce. The machinery functioned because it had been well designed, not because it required constant attention. This autonomy created space for an emperor to question, to study, to transform, to imagine that the same organizational genius that had built an empire of conquest might build an empire of compassion. By the time the year 257 BC closed, Ashoka had emerged from his internal struggle with clarity, if not certainty, commitment, if not complete confidence. He understood what he needed to do, even if he could not entirely predict the outcome. The transformation that had begun as crisis would continue as experiment, an attempt to demonstrate that power could serve purposes other than its own perpetuation, that empire could be more than organized extraction, that a ruler's legacy might be measured not in territory controlled, but in suffering reduced. The work ahead was immense. The obstacles were formidable. The opposition would be persistent, yet the transformation was no longer reversible. The emperor who had questioned violence after Kalinga was becoming the emperor who would proclaim non-violence across his realm, who would carve principles into stone and send them echoing across centuries, who would attempt to turn an empire from conquest to compassion, not perfectly, not completely, but earnestly, and with consequences that would reach far beyond his lifetime into futures he could not imagine and places he would never see. The door had opened. The room beyond was visible now, its dimensions clearer, its possibilities and limitations both evident. Ashoka stood at the threshold, looking back at the path that had brought him here. The succession war, the years of conventional rule, the Kalinga campaign, the crisis of meaning, the slow turning toward different understanding. And then he looked forward, toward the work of making that understanding real, of translating insight into institution, of demonstrating that an empire built on one set of principles might be rebuilt on another. The transformation was not complete. It would never be complete, for transformation is process rather than destination. But it had advanced sufficiently that public expression could begin. The emperor who emerged from these years of internal struggle was preparing to announce himself to his empire and his age, to carve his convictions into stone and policy, to attempt what no ruler before him had attempted: the governance of vast territories according to principles of compassion rather than conquest, the wielding of absolute power in service of reducing rather than inflicting suffering. The silence was ending, the announcements were beginning, and in the stonemasons' yards of Pataliputra, workers were preparing the pillars and rock faces that would carry the emperor's words across his empire, proclaiming a vision that was part political program, part spiritual instruction, and part desperate hope that power, having learned to destroy, might learn instead to build, not cities or armies, but the conditions in which suffering could be diminished and compassion could flourish, even if imperfectly, even if incompletely, even if only as aspiration carved in stone against the forgetting of time. Conviction finds its proof not in what a man says, but in what he builds, and what Ashoka built during the years following his transformation was unprecedented. An attempt to make ethics visible across an empire, to translate inner change into outer structure, to carve principles into stone and policy both. The emperor who had once measured success in territory now measured it in suffering reduced, in compassion encouraged, in the slow work of turning an empire from instrument of conquest into instrument of welfare. The task was vast, perhaps impossible, yet the attempt would reshape South Asian civilization for centuries to come. The most visible manifestation of this new vision appeared in the form of edicts, royal proclamations inscribed on pillars and rock faces throughout the empire. These were not the first royal inscriptions India had known, but they were different in purpose and tone. Where earlier rulers had proclaimed victories and divine favor, Ashoka's edicts announced principles, admitted failings, and instructed his subjects in ethical conduct. They were conversation carved in stone, an emperor speaking directly to his people across distances that would otherwise have reduced him to rumor and abstraction. Rock Edict 13, likely among the earliest of these proclamations to be inscribed around 257 BC, contained the acknowledgement that would define his reign: the remorse for Kalinga, the recognition of suffering's scale, the renunciation of conquest by violence. The beloved of the gods conquered the Kalingas 8 years after his coronation. The text began, establishing chronology before moving to consequence. The edict then detailed the casualties: 100,000 killed, 150,000 deported, before making its extraordinary admission: even 100th or 1,000th part of all those killed or dead or deported during the conquest of Kalinga now weighs heavily on the mind of the beloved of the gods. The edict continued with a declaration that would have seemed incomprehensible to previous generations of rulers. Now the beloved of the gods deeply regrets having conquered the Kalingas. Indeed, the beloved of the gods is deeply pained by the killing, dying, and deportation that take place when an unconquered country is conquered. And then came the transformation of regret into policy. Even greater is the beloved of the gods' pain that Brahmins, ascetics, and householders of various religions live in those countries, and who are respectful to superiors, to mother and father, to elders, and who behave properly toward friends, acquaintances, companions. relatives, servants, and employees. All of this weighs heavily on the mind of the beloved of the gods. The edict concluded with the most remarkable claim of all, that conquest through Dhamma was superior to conquest through violence, that the spreading of ethical principles represented the truest victory. This was not merely personal transformation, but a political theology, an attempt to redefine what imperial power meant and what purposes it should serve. The words were carried across the empire and inscribed in multiple scripts: Brahmi for most regions, Kharosti for the northwest, Greek and Aramaic for the territories that still remembered Alexander's passage, ensuring that the message reached every population the empire encompassed. Other edicts followed, each addressing different aspects of the Dhamma Ashoka hoped to promote. Rock Edict II proclaimed the establishment of medical facilities for humans and animals alike, the planting of medicinal herbs along roads, the digging of wells and construction of rest houses for travelers. These were not merely charitable gestures, but systematic programs funded by the imperial treasury and administered by a new class of officials. The empire that had perfected the extraction of resources now redirected those resources toward welfare, attempting to demonstrate that power could serve purposes other than its own perpetuation. The creation of the Dhamma Mahamatras, officers of Dhamma, around 256 BC, represented the institutionalization of Ashoka's vision. These officials, appointed directly by the emperor, traveled throughout the empire with a mandate that went beyond traditional administrative duties. They were to promote harmonious relations among different religious communities, ensure proper treatment of servants and slaves, mediate family disputes, inspect welfare programs, and generally encourage the ethical conduct that Dhamma prescribed. Rock Edict 5 and Pillar Edict 7 detailed their responsibilities, creating a bureaucratic apparatus dedicated to moral instruction and social welfare. The appointment represented both innovation and risk. Traditional officials administered law and collected taxes, functions with clear metrics of success or failure. The Dhamma Mahamatras were tasked with shaping behavior and promoting values, work whose success could not be easily measured and whose methods risked overreach into private life. Yet Ashoka persisted, understanding that if Dhamma was to be more than proclamation, it required agents empowered to translate principle into practice. Animal welfare received particular emphasis in multiple edicts. Rock Edict. I listed species protected from slaughter: parrots, myna birds, ruddy geese, wild geese, the nandamuka, bats, queen ants, terrapins, boneless fish, porcupines, squirrels, deer, bulls, and many others. The list was specific and extensive, reflecting both Buddhist values of non-violence toward all sentient beings and practical concern for the ecosystem that sustained agriculture. The edict also banned the castration of roosters and the branding of horses, details that suggest genuine attention to animal suffering, rather than merely symbolic gestures. The imperial kitchen, which had previously consumed hundreds of animals daily to feed the court and its dependents, underwent dramatic reform. Rock Edict. I noted that formerly thousands of animals were slaughtered each day for royal meals. Now that number was reduced to just 3, 2 peacocks and 1 deer, and even those would soon be spared. This was not merely personal asceticism, but a signal to the empire that if the emperor could reduce his consumption, so could his subjects, that restraint was a virtue to be cultivated rather than a weakness to be overcome. The establishment of veterinary hospitals alongside facilities for human medical care represented another practical expression of Dhamma principles. Pillar Edict 2. recorded that medical treatment for humans and animals had been provided throughout the empire and in neighboring kingdoms as well. Medicinal herbs were cultivated and distributed. Where they were not locally available, they were imported and planted. The program demonstrated administrative capacity redirected from military logistics to welfare infrastructure. The same organizational genius that had supplied armies now supplied hospitals. Justice system reforms attempted to balance the Arthashastra's emphasis on punishment with Dhamma's emphasis on compassion. Pillar Edict 4 described modifications to judicial procedure. Prisoners were given 3 days before execution to prepare themselves spiritually and allow time for appeals. Regular reviews of judicial decisions were mandated, with Ashoka himself reportedly spending time each day, hearing cases, and ensuring that justice was administered fairly. The reforms did not eliminate punishment. The death penalty remained for serious crimes, but they introduced restraint and review into a system that had previously operated with minimal oversight. The construction program that characterized these years extended beyond inscriptions to include physical infrastructure that embodied Dhamma principles. Wells were dug every half kos along major routes, approximately every half mile, providing water for travelers and their animals. Rest houses offered shelter, shade trees were planted, mango groves that would take decades to mature, banyan trees whose spreading branches would shelter multiple generations. The programs demonstrated a temporal vision that extended beyond the ruler's lifetime, planning for benefits that Ashoka himself would never see. Rock Edict 12, inscribed around 255 BC, addressed religious tolerance directly. One should not honor only one's own religion and condemn the religions of others. One should honor other religions for various reasons. By so doing, one helps one's own religion to grow and renders service to the religions of others too. In acting otherwise, one digs the grave of one's own religion and also does harm to other religions. The principle was not relativism. Ashoka clearly believed Buddhist ethics superior, but pragmatic recognition that an empire encompassing diverse communities required respect across difference rather than forced uniformity. The edict continued with language that balanced conviction and tolerance. Whoever praises his own religion due to excessive devotion and condemns others with the thought, "Let me glorify my own religion," only harms his own religion. Therefore, contact between religions is good. One should listen to and respect the doctrines professed by others. This was governance informed by Buddhist teaching about right speech and skillful means, applied to the practical challenge of maintaining harmony in a religiously plural society. Yet tolerance had limits. The edicts condemned practices Ashoka considered contrary to Dhamma: cruel sports, meaningless ceremonies, and rituals that promoted superstition over ethical conduct. Rock Edict 9 criticized elaborate ceremonies conducted for illness, marriages, births, or before journeys, suggesting instead that Dhamma ceremonies, acts of compassion, respect for teachers, proper treatment of servants, represented true religious observance. The distinction was between form and substance, between ritual that served social convention and practice that reduced suffering. The Bodhi tree at Bodh Gaya, marking the site of the Buddha's enlightenment, received special protection and patronage. Ashoka constructed shrines and endowed the location with resources to maintain it for future generations. His wife, Tishyaraksha, according to Buddhist sources, allegedly grew jealous of the attention he devoted to the tree and attempted to destroy it through poison, though she later repented. The story, whether historical or legendary, captured the tensions that Ashoka's devotion sometimes created within his own household and court. Throughout these years, Ashoka maintained the administrative efficiency that had characterized his earlier reign. While redirecting its purposes, tax collection continued, though rates may have been moderated in some regions. The military remained intact, its garrisons maintaining order and defending borders, though no major campaigns of expansion were launched. Provincial governance operated smoothly, with governors receiving detailed instructions about implementing Dhamma policies while retaining discretion in local matters. The empire functioned because its fundamental structures remained sound, even as the values guiding those structures transformed. The edicts themselves varied in tone and content depending on their location and intended audience. Those in the northwest, where Greek influence remained strong, were inscribed in Greek and Aramaic and emphasized universal ethical principles that would resonate with Hellenistic philosophical traditions. Those in central India spoke more directly about Buddhist concepts while framing them in language accessible to diverse religious communities. The adaptation demonstrated sophistication. Dhamma was presented not as foreign imposition, but as articulation of values that different traditions could recognize and embrace. By 250 BC, a decade after Kalinga, and 7 years into the public proclamation of Dhamma, the transformation of the empire was visible in stone and policy across its expanse, from the Hindu Kush to Bengal, from the Himalayas to Karnataka. Ashoka's pillars and rock edicts proclaimed principles that challenged the logic of conquest, while the infrastructure of welfare demonstrated those principles in practice. Medical facilities treated the sick, wells provided water, shade trees offered relief from the sun, and officials promoted ethical conduct through instruction and example. Yet the transformation was incomplete and contested. Provincial governors sometimes interpreted Dhamma policies selectively, emphasizing those that served their interests while neglecting others. Religious communities that benefited from the status quo resisted changes that threatened their privileges. Military officers trained in conquest struggled to embrace restraint. The gap between proclamation and practice, between ideal and implementation, remained significant. Ashoka acknowledged this in his edicts, admitting that perfection was impossible, but insisting that sincere effort was required. The emperor himself aged through these years of intense activity. The man who had once measured his vigor through military campaigns now measured it through the capacity to govern, according to principles that often contradicted immediate advantage. The work was exhausting, not merely physically, but spiritually. The constant negotiation between power's logic and compassion's demands. The daily confrontation with how far the ideal exceeded the actual. The recognition that even an emperor's authority had limits when trying to reshape human behavior. Still, the achievement was remarkable. Ashoka had demonstrated that an empire built on conquest could be maintained and even strengthened through policies emphasizing welfare over extraction, compassion over cruelty, moral instruction over mere force. The experiment was imperfect, its success partial, but it had transformed what seemed possible. An emperor who had waded through blood to reach his throne had carved in stone a vision of governance that would inspire rulers and reformers for millennia to come. The pillars rose from the earth, like exclamation points, their polished sandstone surfaces catching light and casting shadows across landscapes where they would stand for centuries. The rock faces bore inscriptions that weathered storms and survived kingdoms, their messages enduring long after the empire that created them had dissolved. And in the villages and cities, the wells provided water, the hospitals treated illness, and the officials promoted principles that, however imperfectly applied, represented an attempt to make power serve purposes larger than itself. Ashoka's Dhamma was spreading through administrative directive and moral persuasion, but the vision that had transformed one emperor would soon reach beyond imperial borders, carried by messengers who traveled not with armies, but with teachings, not to conquer territory, but to offer what they believed was liberation itself. The next phase of the story would take Dhamma beyond India, transforming it from an emperor's ethical program into one of the world's great religious traditions. The stone endured, the message traveled, and in the space between what was proclaimed and what was possible, an empire tried to become something history had not yet seen. A demonstration that the greatest conquest was not of lands, but of the human capacity for causing suffering. That the truest victory was not domination, but the spread of compassion, imperfect and incomplete, yet genuine in its aspiration and revolutionary in its attempt. Ideas travel farther than armies and endure longer than empires. What had begun as one man's transformation and become one empire's experiment, now prepared to cross seas and mountains, carried not by conquest, but by conviction, not by soldiers, but by monks who owned nothing but robes and conviction. The Dhamma that Ashoka had carved into stone across India would be carried in memory and practice to lands he would never see, transforming the religious geography of Asia in ways that would outlast the political structures that had enabled its spread. The decision to send missions beyond India's borders emerged from the convergence of spiritual conviction and political calculation. Ashoka understood that Dhamma's truth claims were universal. If Buddhist teaching accurately described the nature of suffering and the path to its cessation, then those insights belonged to all humanity, not merely to one empire. Yet he also recognized that spreading Buddhism strengthened India's cultural influence in ways that military conquest never could, creating networks of goodwill and shared values that would facilitate trade and diplomacy for generations. The organizational framework for these missions took shape around 250 BC, during what Buddhist chronicles describe as the Third Buddhist Council, held at Pataliputra under Ashoka's patronage. The historical details remain uncertain. No contemporary inscriptions mention the council, and later accounts written by Buddhist communities may have amplified or invented aspects to legitimize their own doctrinal positions. Yet beneath whatever legendary embellishment exists, a core of fact seems likely: that during Ashoka's reign, the Buddhist Sangha organized systematically to address questions of doctrine, discipline, and missionary activity. The council, according to tradition, was presided over by Moggaliputta Tissa, the senior monk who had guided Ashoka's deepening understanding of Buddhist teaching. It assembled hundreds of monks to resolve disputes that had emerged as Buddhism spread across diverse regions with varying interpretations of the Buddha's words. The deliberations resulted in the compilation of authoritative texts and, crucially, the decision to dispatch trained monks to regions within and beyond Ashoka's empire to establish Sangha communities and spread the Dhamma. The missions were carefully planned rather than spontaneous. Monks were selected not merely for their spiritual attainment, but for their capacity to adapt teaching to new cultural contexts, to learn foreign languages, to endure the hardships of long travel, and to establish viable communities in lands where Buddhism was unknown. They departed with imperial support, provisions for the journey, letters of introduction to local rulers, and the prestige that came from association with the most powerful emperor in South Asia. Yet they traveled without military escort, demonstrating through their vulnerability the non-violent principles they proclaimed. The mission to Sri Lanka stands foremost in both historical record and consequence. Mahinda, Ashoka's son by Devi, led a delegation of monks across the narrow strait separating the island from the Indian mainland Buddhist chronicles. The Mahavamsa and Dipavamsa, compiled centuries later, but drawing on earlier traditions, describe his arrival at the invitation of King Devanampiya Tissa of Anuradhapura, who had heard of Ashoka's transformation and sought understanding of the teaching that had changed an emperor. The meeting between Mahinda and Tissa, as recorded in these chronicles, took the form of a philosophical dialogue rather than political negotiation. Through questions and answers, through parables and explanations, Mahinda conveyed Buddhist teaching in terms that resonated with the king's concerns and experience. The conversion was not coerced, but persuaded, not imposed, but offered, demonstrating the method that would characterize Buddhist expansion: adaptation to local context while maintaining essential principles. Following Mahinda's initial success, his sister Sanghamita arrived bringing a cutting from the Bodhi tree at Bodh Gaya, the very tree under which the Buddha had attained enlightenment. The cutting was planted in Anuradhapura with elaborate ceremony, establishing both a physical connection to Buddhism's origins and a symbol of the Dhamma taking root in new soil. That tree, known as the Jaya Sri Mahabodhi, still grows today, making it among the oldest continuously documented trees in the world, a living link to Ashoka's age and the missionary impulse he fostered. Sri Lanka's conversion proved consequential beyond its immediate effects. The island became a major center of Buddhist learning and practice, preserving Pali texts and maintaining traditions that would later spread to Southeast Asia. The Buddhism that took root there emphasized the older Theravada school, focused on individual liberation through monastic discipline and meditation. From Sri Lankan monasteries, the tradition would eventually reach Burma, Thailand, Cambodia, and Laos, shaping the religious landscape of mainland Southeast Asia for millennia. Other missions ventured into regions whose precise locations and outcomes remain more obscure. Dharmaraksita was sent to Aparantaka, generally identified with Gujarat, and regions beyond India's western coast. Maharaksita travelled to Iona, likely the Greek-influenced territories of Bactria, where Hellenistic culture had been established after Alexander's conquests. The mission to these Greek kingdoms reflected Ashoka's recognition that Dhamma's principles could find resonance even among people whose philosophical traditions differed dramatically from Indian thought. Rock Edict 13, carved around this period, specifically mentioned rulers of Hellenistic kingdoms by name: Antiochus II Theos of the Seleucid Empire, Ptolemy II Philadelphos of Egypt, Antikyne, Antigonus II Gonatas of Macedonia, Magas of Cyrene, and Alikasudaro, Alexander of Epirus or Corinth. Whether Ashoka's missions actually reached all these distant courts remains uncertain, but the fact that he knew their names and claimed to have sent envoys demonstrates the geographic scope of his diplomatic and religious vision. Archaeological evidence supports at least limited Greek engagement with these missions. The Kandahar bilingual rock inscription, discovered in modern Afghanistan, presents Ashokan Dhamma principles in both Greek and Aramaic, using philosophical terminology familiar to Hellenistic audiences. The Greek text speaks of eusebia, piety, and self-control, translating Buddhist concepts into vocabulary that would resonate with those educated in Greek philosophy. The adaptation demonstrated sophistication. Dhamma was presented not as foreign doctrine, but as wisdom that Greek ethical thought could recognize and embrace. Majantika led missions to Kashmir and Gandhara, regions in the northwest that had long been crossroads between Indian and Central Asian cultures. Their Buddhism found fertile ground among populations accustomed to diverse influences and open to new teachings. The monasteries established in these regions would later serve as way stations for Buddhism's transmission along the Silk Road into Central Asia, China, and eventually Korea and Japan. What Ashoka's missionaries planted in the 3rd century BC would bear fruit across continents over the following millennium. Southward, missions traveled to regions beyond direct Mauryan control. The kingdoms of the Deccan and the southern tip of the subcontinent Rakita went to Vanavasi, Yona Dhammarakita to Aparantaka, Dhammarakita to Maharashtra. In these southern territories, Buddhism encountered populations with their own well-developed religious traditions, yet the teaching found adherence through the same method that had succeeded elsewhere: patient instruction, ethical example, and the appeal of a doctrine that addressed universal human concerns about suffering and its cessation. The Himalayan regions received attention as well. Missions to Nepal established communities that would preserve Buddhist traditions through centuries of political change. The seeds planted during Ashoka's reign would eventually germinate in Tibet, where Buddhism, arriving centuries later through multiple routes, would develop unique forms that synthesized Indian teaching with indigenous Bon traditions. The transmission was neither direct nor immediate, but the initial missionary impulse during Ashoka's time created networks and precedents that facilitated later expansion. The method these missions employed combined several elements. First came the establishment of viharas, monasteries that served as centers for teaching, meditation, and community formation. These institutions provided stability, continuity, and a physical presence that demonstrated Buddhism's commitment to the regions it entered. Second, the missions offered practical benefits alongside spiritual teaching. Medical knowledge, literacy, agricultural techniques, and ethical frameworks that helped organize community life. Buddhism spread not merely as abstract philosophy, but as a comprehensive approach to living that addressed practical as well as spiritual needs. Third, the missions adapted teaching to local contexts without abandoning essential principles. In regions with strong devotional traditions, Buddhism emphasized practices of reverence and merit-making. In areas influenced by philosophical schools, it presented the Dhamma as rational investigation of existence. Among populations concerned with social order, it offered ethical guidelines that complemented existing moral frameworks. This flexibility allowed Buddhism to enter diverse cultures without requiring complete rejection of existing beliefs and practices. The economic infrastructure that Ashoka had developed to support internal welfare programs also facilitated these missions. The roads he had built connected regions previously difficult to reach. The rest houses provided shelter for traveling monks. The wells and shade trees made long journeys survivable. The administrative efficiency that had once supplied armies now supplied missionary expeditions with provisions, letters of safe passage, and introductions to local officials. The empire's material resources served spiritual purposes, demonstrating how thoroughly Ashoka had redirected state capacity from conquest to propagation of Dhamma. Yet the spread of Buddhism was not merely top-down imperial project, but also organic growth emerging from the teaching's appeal. Merchants who traded across Ashoka's empire and beyond carried Buddhist ideas along with their goods. Soldiers stationed in distant garrisons encountered monks and brought practices home when their service ended. Pilgrims who visited sacred sites in India returned to their homelands with new understanding and commitment. The formal missions Ashoka sponsored operated within this larger context of informal transmission, amplifying and organizing processes already underway. By 240 BC, 2 decades into this missionary phase, Buddhism had established presence far beyond its origins in the Gangetic Plain. From Sri Lanka to Central Asia, from the Deccan to the Himalayas, monasteries housed communities of monks who taught, meditated, and served as exemplars of the Dhamma, the teaching that had begun with one man's enlightenment under a tree, that had been preserved and transmitted for 2 centuries through oral tradition, now found institutional forms and geographic reach that would ensure its survival and continued evolution. Ashoka himself remained in Pataliputra, aging into his 50s, receiving reports of missions' successes and challenges, corresponding with distant rulers who had received his envoys, and continuing to govern an empire that had become his laboratory for demonstrating that power could serve compassion. The energy required for both internal governance and external mission was immense, yet he sustained it through conviction that the suffering he had caused at Kalinga could be partially redeemed through the suffering reduction these missions might achieve across generations and continents. The cultural exchange worked in multiple directions. As Buddhism spread outward from India, it absorbed influences from the cultures it encountered, developing art forms, architectural styles, and doctrinal emphases that reflected local genius as much as Indian origins. The process that would eventually produce the diverse schools of Buddhism, Theravada in Southeast Asia, Mahayana in East Asia, Vajrayana in Tibet, had its roots in this Ashokan period, when the teaching first moved systematically across cultural and linguistic boundaries. The empire's prosperity during these years enabled the missionary enterprise. Trade flourished along routes secured by Mauryan garrisons, generating revenues that funded both welfare programs and religious missions. The peace that Ashoka's governance had established, imperfect but real, created conditions where merchants, monks, and messengers could travel safely across vast distances. The infrastructure and stability that power had built now served purposes its builder had not originally intended, demonstrating how completely the emperor's priorities had shifted from when he had first seized the throne. Yet beneath the success, the seeds of future fragmentation were being planted. The very missions that spread Dhamma beyond India also created Buddhist communities, whose primary loyalty was to the teaching rather than to the emperor who had facilitated its spread. The universalism that Buddhism claimed transcended the particularism of empire, suggesting that truth belonged to no single ruler or territory. Ashoka had unleashed forces that would outlast the political structures that had enabled them, forces that would prove both his greatest legacy and a challenge to the empire's cohesion after his death. The monks who travelled these missionary paths did so with light packs and heavy purpose, carrying in memory the suttas they had memorized, the meditation techniques they had mastered, and the conviction that what they offered was liberation itself. They walked roads Ashoka had built, sheltered in rest houses his administration maintained, and benefited from the prestige his patronage conferred. Yet the teaching they carried was not his to control or direct. It belonged to whoever sincerely practiced it, whoever investigated its claims and found them valid through experience. By the time the decade closed, Buddhism had been transformed from an Indian religious movement into an Asian phenomenon, from a teaching preserved by relatively small communities into a tradition with presence across kingdoms and cultures. The transformation was not complete. Centuries would pass before Buddhism reached its greatest geographic extent. But the pattern was established. What Ashoka had begun as expiation for the violence of Kalinga had become one of the great cultural transmissions in human history. The pillars he had erected within India proclaimed Dhamma to his subjects. The monks he had sent abroad carried that same Dhamma beyond his authority, beyond his lifetime, into futures he could not control and could barely imagine. Power had found a purpose beyond itself, and in serving that purpose had created something that would survive power's inevitable dissolution. The sun moved across Asian skies, illuminating lands that would remember Ashoka long after his empire had crumbled, that would preserve his teaching long after his inscriptions had weathered into illegibility, that would carry forward the aspiration he had carved in stone, that suffering could be reduced, that compassion could be cultivated, and that the greatest conquest was not of territory, but of the human heart's capacity for cruelty, gradually, imperfectly, but genuinely transformed by teaching and practice and the long, slow work of becoming less violent, more compassionate, more awake to the suffering we cause and the suffering we might reduce. The missions continued, the Dharma spread, and in the palace at Pataliputra, an aging emperor looked toward horizons he would never see, trusting that the seeds he had helped plant would find their own water, their own light, their own seasons of flowering in gardens he would never walk, but whose existence justified everything the Kalinga campaign had cost him to learn.